Hi. Security has an image problem. This is not exactly news to the people in this room, right? This is one part of that problem. We're seen as a roadblock to most organizations. Heck, I've spent a lot of time doing the compliance work in the last couple of years, and even within security, the compliance people are seen as obstructionist pedants. We're the pariah within the larger security pariah. Just like coming upon a road full of goats, the reaction to security measures, and often the people who are proposing the security measures, is not usually, look, there's all these cute goats. It's, oh, for God's sakes, I do not have time to choose a new password that's at least 14 characters long, it contains 2 uppercase and 2 lowercase, and 3 special characters, and doesn't repeat any of the last 15 passwords I had, and doesn't have more than 2 repeating characters, and doesn't contain my mother's maiden name, and how do I go around this? I will bribe people so I can get my actual job done. It doesn't, of course, help that the security industry is also perceived as being unresponsive to questions. As Taylor Swift recently pointed out, when people ask questions of security people, this tends to be the typical response, right? Maybe not from every single security person, but if it's the response that a user gets from one security person, it creates an expectation in that user for the next time. And unfortunately, people tend to share their negative impressions of security people with their friends. And to be clear, like, hashtag not all security people, right? But also hashtag enough security people that we should actually be concerned about this problem. We can't, which is too long for Twitter, by the way, we can't do our job if this is the reality for our users. More concerningly, for the nice people in this room, we can't do our job if our users think that this kind of thing will be our response, even when it actually won't. It turns out that chilling effects of having our users think that they're stupid and evil are in fact chilling, and then users don't come to us, and we can never help them. So I saw this tweet the other day, and it really resonated with me. I've worked for organizations that had major shadow IT problems because the response from IT for every user request for the last 3 years had been closed won't fix, including for things like, I actually need this to support a direct customer request. It's just like, I don't care, go away, your troubles don't bother me at all. And even if that's not your response, if users come from other places where that was a typical response, you have an image problem that you didn't make, but ultimately one for which you are responsible. Making our problems worse, security people have a huge amount of access. And as I'll mention in more depth later, even good security people with all the right goals and duties and ethics in mind treat this access as kind of a perk of the job, right? The issue is that when the public perception of IT and security staff is all the staff who abuse their power to spy on normal users, it makes it harder for us, the nice people, to do our job. Our access is a trust and a burden, and we need to remember that, but a slightly harder problem is that we need to make it clear to the users that we remember that this is a trust that we protect and a burden. So the simple answer to all of this is, well, maybe security people should be nice to people, like really nice, so that they like us. And that's true. We should be nice to people. That's also not enormously helpful for most of us. It's way too general to provide any kind of specific advice, and it's also impossible to be nice all the time, with a few talented, sainted exceptions, one of whom is sitting in the room, who, despite crazy people, always seems to be like smiling. We need something that has a bit more structure than just be nice, in a way where, yes, as Douglas Adams suggested, nobody has to get nailed to anything, but ideally a strategy that's designed for the real world, where we have a ton of power and a ton of authority, but we need to interact with users who might see us as obstructions or even just be scared, right? And this is a common problem. When people see hackers, right, they see the CNN coverage, oh my God, all the hackers are in Vegas and they have blue hair. And they read about the power that we've accreted, either from normal operations side or just the red teaming side. It's terrifying, right? The first time you've told a non-technical user about something as simple as a Wi-Fi pineapple, what was their response? I'll bet it wasn't, that seems neat. I'll bet it was, that's incredibly terrifying. And the problem is, if you know you have people in your organization with that level of power, even if they seem nice most of the time, you're worried about the larger thing. This is similar to Canada's problem, right? There are nuclear weapons in your backyard. Most of the time, the Americans seem nice. I wonder if they're going to turn orange and not nice, and then do bad things with them, right? This is the problem with security operations. So before getting onto what the solution is, let me introduce myself. Hi, I'm Brendan. I'm a security researcher. I'm a security consultant. I'm also an attorney with a deep academic computer science background. I do a bunch of different things. I'm admitted to the bar, or what Canadians awesomely call called to the bar, which is a wonderful expression, in my home state of Montana, but I actually live in Seattle. And I'm looking for a new opportunity. So if you like what you see in this presentation, let's talk later. If you don't like what you see in this presentation, harass me on Twitter. It's what everybody else does, and it's great. Moving swiftly onward. It turns out there's a good historical precedent for the situation of a small, powerful group needing to interact peaceably with a larger society. I'm not an incredible student of history, partially because lazy, partially because typical American. So I first came across this while reading Halting State by Charles Stross, which is a near-future sci-fi novel. And if you haven't read it, you definitely should. It's a novel about augmented reality, alternate reality games, and distributed security in MMORPGs. It's kind of like the Internet of Orcs, if you like. And like the Internet of Things, you can still use the Internet of Orcs to attack Brian Krebs, which is helpful. So, not a joke, you should definitely read the book. In the 18-teens and the 1820s, London, which had been, like, let's be clear, a big deal city, right? I'm not gonna say, well, London was a hamlet until the 1820s. No, London had been a big deal for like 900 years. But in the 18-teens and 1820s, we have the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution and the beginnings of the modern kind of urbanization trend. And so London was growing ever more massive. The police force was not. There's a huge variety of detail to what I'm going to say next, so I'm going to basically hand wave over all of it. But the summary of this is that policing in general, in the whole world, was mostly handled by local constables, right? There's not a lot of order to constables. There's no constabular academy. There's none of that, right? There is pretty much the kindly old guy who locks up the drunk and lets him go the next morning, right? More problematically than that, London, then as now, was a metropolis composed of a ton of small towns, not one enormous city. So to give you an idea, this is London, just the little red outlined area. This is the city of London. These days, the city of London is basically just huge financial building towers. Nobody actually lives in the city of London, or almost nobody. So it stands that since this city is small and filled with no houses, Greater London must be bigger, right? Well, how much bigger is it? Well, we can zoom out, and then we can zoom out. You can still see the little red area, and then we zoom out again, and this is modern Greater London. It's essentially bounded by this ring road, the M25. They're not going quite that far in every direction. And this immediately headache-inducing slide is all the little tiny towns inside Greater London, right? And if they're all doing individual policing, it becomes, let's go with tricky, to ensure that the laws work the same way everywhere, not to mention jurisdictional issues every 3 blocks or so, right? Stop, or I'll run after you. And then you hit, you cross a road, and now you're in a different town, and now you're out of luck. So obviously, then like now, there's some cooperation between constables of neighboring hamlets, but cooperation isn't the same thing as unified jurisdiction, and this makes things complex. So at this point, the Home Secretary, who's the guy in charge of domestic affairs for the UK, was a gentleman named Sir Robert Peel. And this guy had an amazing resume, right? He was in power, accreted way too much power. He actually became both Prime Minister and Home Secretary at once, which is a really bad idea for the same reason you don't let developers push code into production. And eventually he was like out of power for a little bit, Minister of the Loyal Opposition, and then back in power, and eventually out of power again because he retired. So to handle the issue of greater policing, or of policing across all of Greater London, which is actually what it's called, by the way, Greater London is an actual like census boundary, he wanted to create a London Metropolitan Police Force. And at the time, the population was like not in favor of this. There was only one other major European city with a unified police force, and it was Paris. And there's 2 different issues here. One is that it's Paris, and the UK never been a big fan of any proposal that starts with, let's do exactly what they do in France, right? And that's before you get to the fact that they'd been fighting at war with Paris for basically the last 50 years, most of the last 50 years. But in addition, the Parisian police were not police. They were not kind of like friendly, happy police. They were what we'd usually think of today as secret political police, with all of the intrigue and terror that you'd expect from secret political police. So this is not a good model. The populace is not in favor of new secret police in London. So what was the fix to this? This fundamental principle: the people are the police and the police are the people. And the police are simply paid to give full-time attention to keeping society intact, which is the job of every citizen in some philosophical sense. This either sounds radical or nonsensical, but I think you'll go with radical as we go through the implications of each of the 9 principles. particularly with regard to the relationship between the police, the public, and the last-ditch use of force, of which the principles spend a lot of time on. As an American, of course, I feel like our police could take a lot of pages, indeed all of the pages, from this idea. But they don't listen to me. On the strength of this proposal, then, Peel got the Metro Police Bill through Parliament, and the unified London police were born with this unified ideal. We're going to be very different from the French, which has served them well. They might have said it's, a sense of like of the people, by the people, and for the people, but that was still ticking people off in London at the time, considering the White House had just stopped burning. And thanks for that. As the UK embassy to the United States recently tweeted in response to the White House posting the anniversary of the burning, awkward, which is among the greatest tweets of all time. I note in this slide, by the way, that Sir Robert Peel almost definitely didn't say this originally, and in general didn't lay out the so-called Peelian principles, though he did discuss some of them as kind of general philosophical statements, like what would a great police force look like, both before and after the Metro Police were established. So he was the Home Secretary and made it possible, but the people who actually wrote down these principles were Charles Rowan and Richard Mayne, so like a lot of advances in history, particularly in science and mathematics, the wrong person got it named for him. And not just the principles, the London police were at first derisively, now somewhat more fondly referred to as bobbies after this Robert. So, why am I talking about the history of cops in London for a whole 5 minutes? Because the issues that the police were facing then are strikingly similar to the issues that security people in much larger organizations face now. We have a lot of power and a lot of ability to peer into things that most people can't. The population knows this and is not therefore real predisposed to liking us. They've seen groups like us before that abuse their power. We're tasked with keeping the peace. Any slip-ups will be our fault, but our successes register as nothing, right? Nothing terrible happened today. That's fine, basically, because it's not about us, right? The general populace shouldn't really need to know that we exist. But we do need the leadership to know we exist, because otherwise they won't hire us anymore. So it's a weird balance, right? We need to stay invisible to the public and close to the heart of the leadership, and yet not be creepy secret police and inspire fear and terror and revulsion in the populace. Most fundamentally, though, we're not the point of what's going on. We don't exist for our own sakes, and everyone else will continuously tell us that the organization does not exist for our comfort. We have to integrate into a larger society, and we need their cooperation to make that possible. So to make this work, we're going to apply police stuff to nerddom, just like in this photo. It won't be a shock to you to learn that the rest of this presentation is my proposal for a way to solve it, based on Peel's 9 original principles of policing. I do want to make a few things clear, however, because you're going to hear a lot of ideas that sound somewhat familiar, in a few cases at least. I'm not pretending that nobody has ever thought of any of these ideas before. I'll try to point out major organizations that have done a few things well, in fact. But even when I don't, please don't assume that I think that this is all like brand new. What I think is valuable about using Peel's principles as a strategy for security organizations is that it's an ordered way for security to work within a larger organization or society. Simply shouting "be less terrible" to each other hasn't worked so far. So we need something with more like actionable goals. The fundamental principle is that rather than simply saying suck less, Peel's principles are a framework to guide you in sucking less. So it's not a rant, it's a framework. Secondly, look, this is maybe all terrible. Quite a few people in this room have significantly more experience than I do. I have some, and I've had the privilege to work with a lot of great people who have great experience, some of whom I'm privileged to call friends. And I've tried very consciously to apply this to my own client work. And as I go through, I'll point out things where it's worked really effectively. So it's been much better for me than what I had before, and hopefully it will work for all of you. And if you want, you're welcome to come back in a year or 3 and ask, hey, do you still like that, or is that a terrible idea? And I'll tell you if it was a terrible idea. But for now, it's working for me better than what I had before, and it seems kind of reasonable. So the principles, and we'll go through all 9 in order, because they all have a lot of applicability to security today. So I'm not going to read each one of these, by the way, because I hate it when people throw up quotes on the slides and then read them to you. So that's the general idea. So the first principle is the basic mission, right? And right off the bat, we have 2 major items to apply to security operations. The first major idea here is that prevention is the main order of the day. This is not a shock to security organizations, right? Yes, do not look into laser with remaining eye, right? If we can prevent at least one eye from going to waste, then that was good. there are a few great nuances to how we, what we do for prevention and what we don't do for prevention that we'll go into later. But obviously the basic goal is always, let's make sure bad stuff doesn't happen. But the second idea is also very important. So I live in the US, and as you are no doubt aware, the United States has completely lost its collective mind on the subject of risk. We cannot seem at a mass psychological level to understand risk, or even to compare risks in any kind of reasonable way, right? Like, we freak out at people who light their underpants on fire, and now we have naked scanners in every airport, but we hand guns to toddlers. We take elaborate, hand-wavy cargo culting precautions and blame them on regulations or the lawyers. And then we drive loud, fast cars with no speed limits, and we yell at plaintiffs' attorneys who do things like, well, how dare you sue a teddy bear manufacturer? Well, you know that the teddy bear had an iron rod in its back, right? And that it turns out that when kids trip over it, they die, because that's bad. Yeah, actual thing that actually existed in America in the 80s. Teddy bear with iron spike, because this is why we need plaintiffs' attorneys, right? But we hate the lawyers, because they're terrible. So we're told that the only available success is no attacks, no breaches, no insider threats, no nothing. Victory at all costs, but by all costs, to be very clear, I mean no cost. You can't spend any money, and you certainly can't spend an infinite amount of money, because nobody has an infinite amount of money. So the way to fix this is to point out that defense and cleanup are in effect alternatives, but that like police prevention and police response, more defense will help prevent the need for cleanup, but will not eliminate the need for cleanup. And this is the same solution we already use in other areas. A great example of this is if you want to add another 9 of uptime, you need to double your infrastructure investment, kind of rule of thumb. You can, using this, spend a lot of money and make an outrageously available solution that will work very well, like, say, Amazon Web Services, right? If you look at a region, each individual region is outrageously available. And it will still go down sometimes, like Amazon Web Services does, right? It'll do so in some unexpected or complex or completely random way, right? I recall one postmortem from a few years back where they had, as they always do, they had tested their ground fault interrupters for the whole data center, and one that they had tested just the week before and it worked with flying colors just said, oh my God, there was a lightning strike during a clear day, and cut off power, right? And tried to switch over to battery, and the battery thing failed because that hadn't been tested recently. So basically the data center auto-Darwinated. It was just, okay. And this was not really preventable, right? They had done the prevention things and it just fell over. In Calgary in 2011, one of my other favorite data center failure stories, an explosion in the battery room of a major data center destroyed the equipment that cuts back and forth between the mains power and the backup power. So even though only the batteries were damaged, the data center could no longer figure out that it was plugged in, and so therefore it turned itself off. It's like, all the power is gone, what am I supposed to do? These kinds of complex failures don't happen often in a well-engineered system. The prevention wasn't worthless, it did buy you something for all that money, but bad things will still happen. And so at a certain point, the key is to explain to management that you can spend enough money to prevent all the preventable things, and what will remain will not be nothing. It will be chance occurrences. So how to explain this well is going to be very situation dependent. I did have one client call a little over a year ago that made me laugh. The client wanted security and compliance solutions that would, quote, make sure we don't get sued, right? And he said this like over and over. This was a repeated thing. And that's not how security works. Of course, security is not in the business of making you get sued. But I eventually had to step in to point out that that's not how lawyers work either, right? Lawyers are not vampires, and compliance is not garlic. You might still get sued, right? Or your data center might just fall over. What we can do with security work is make sure that when you get sued, you are at least right, and therefore have the best chance of success. Or for spending on infrastructure, we can make sure that when bad things happen, you had every backup system reasonably available in place, and sometimes that will have a cascading failure. Is this a perfect answer? No. It's actually a deeply unsatisfying answer, right? Because, like, I want things to just stand up and work for 1,000 years, and they don't, and that's annoying. But it's not an answer that stops the conversation. It's one that guides the conversation towards one about risk tolerance and risk management, and eventually acceptance, right? It's like the stages of grief. And so we're going to come back to that idea as we go through the rest of this presentation about guiding the conversation rather than just stopping it. This is the second principle. And the core idea here is we're dependent upon public approval and public respect to do our jobs. And this shouldn't be like a shock, right? But it sure seems like a problem. I've actually watched organizations that were at war with their internal organizations, like their subgroups, right? They're at war with internal IT, or at war with HR, or at war with security, or anything, really. It can actually happen in any group. I watched one company I was doing some work for transform an internal political struggle between two essentially co-equal managers into an internal technical struggle where these groups hated each other so badly that they built software that couldn't interact with the other side of the company, which caused actual measurable harm because politics became engineering failure. And I'm sure there's, like, civil engineers have a lot of stories like this, but I'm not that kind of an engineer, so I didn't do it. Beyond edge cases, right, that are just horror shows, there's a deliberate call to action on this point. Again, security isn't the mission of the organization. It's a critical part of making the mission happen, but it's not the goal. It's not even the goal at security-first organizations, like, since our keynote person mentioned it 17 times, Open Whisper Systems, who makes Signal. Security is not their number one goal. Security is like their goal 1.5. A messaging system is their number one goal that is usable, that has an actual UX that people want to use. Because otherwise, it doesn't matter how secure it is, no one's going to use it, or only extreme edge nerds are going to use it. And for a perfect example of that, of course, we have PGP, which works pretty well, right? There's metadata, but setting metadata aside, the security is quite good on the messages. What's not good is everything that surrounds it to make an actual messaging ecosystem, which is why you have problems like people replying with unencrypted text and unencrypted reply text to an encrypted email, which is bad, right? It makes security people sad. So even for security-first organizations, security is a critical part of their value proposition, but it's not their only part, and it can't be their primary part. So given this, remember that you're the support organization, and that while they can't win without you, you can and will lose much more quickly if you lose their respect. They don't need to have an entire marching band saying how awesome you are, though that is cool, right? We tried it at Wisconsin, and it's kind of neat. But you all need to be on the same side. No, that is not a cheering party for the security org at Wisconsin, by the way. That would be cool. As a follow-on to this, it's easier for our entire industry to have the approval and respect of the rest of the planet if we act like mature adults. And when prominent conferences that are clearly not SecTor advertise themselves as drinking first and conference second, and I actually don't mean the Vegas cons, they're not the worst ones about this, or when information in the industry is held hostage by people with a sexist axe to grind, it makes it very hard to claim that security deserves a seat at the adults' table. It also makes it hard to get approval to attend conferences, which is not an incidental problem for at least me. We don't all need to have the respect and excellent judicial robes of the Supreme Court of Canada, but we do need to be the industry we actually want to work for. And yes, I do apologize on behalf of our late Justice Scalia, who insulted the judicial robes. Those are amazing, just by the way. Every lawyer in the world thinks those are great. So this is the third principle. Unwilling cooperation. There's no need to name and shame anyone on this slide, but I will point out that there are many prominent security people for whom I have a great deal of professional respect, whose approach to security within companies seems to be to shame people who aren't security experts for not being as paranoid as a professional security expert, which bugs the crap out of me and also hurts our rapport with the users. I've not found a single person in a professional setting whose response to daily abuse is, well, I should just do everything in my power to get better so that this person likes me. In fact, when we see that in other contexts, we call it an abusive relationship, right? And if we have an abusive relationship with the other support organizations, nothing works well. So why is it okay for us to say, well, how dare this support staff member do something foolish, like plug in a USB key that came from my insurance company, except didn't actually, right? But it was silkscreened with the insurance company's logo, it came in the right envelope, it had my name on it, all these things. It just turns out that none of those things are hard to fake, right? We would all just say, well, basically don't plug anything USB in. If that point wasn't made to you before today's lunch talk, then certainly was made for you at today's lunch talk. Never plug anything in. The internet is filled of dangerous. But most people don't think of the bad USB exploit, right? Or the power USB exploit, or the turn a USB key or a printer wire into a radio antenna thing that came out of the Research University of Tel Aviv a few months ago. So it's human nature to vent about things, right? I've had clients come to me with exquisitely self-inflicted wounds, things that are kind of bad and yet so funny that it's hard not to laugh at them. And it's perfectly fine and human to want to tell these things to your friends, right? You can go have a drink, you can unwind, you can tell stories. We're all going to do that at like 5:30. You can even do so in a public forum, right? The DEF CON Comedy Jam, popularly known as the Fail Panel, which apparently rides again tomorrow afternoon, used to be excellent at this before they ended at DEF CON 22. Remember, however, that when you rant about how awful non-technical or non-security people are in public, and I don't just mean telling stories, but the kind of abuse of users like, those people should never be allowed to touch a keyboard, which yes, I see on a daily basis on my very security-oriented Twitter feed, you run the risk that you'll make it more unlikely that users will bring things to you. And it's not a direct thing. It won't necessarily be the user you're ranting about or even the company you're ranting about if you're a consultant and work with a bunch of them. But if your public reputation is that you have no empathy for mistakes, then people will stop bringing them to you. And it's bad, right? I've learned incredible things about really bad breaches in regulated corporations from low-level employees whose job was not security. Their job wasn't even technical, right? They were a people person. They liked people. And there's two people laughing, no one else gets referenced, it's fine. But this is actually very important, right? We need their trust. A story that's not mine, but which blew up the internet a few months ago, so you might have seen it, came out from a financial institution with extensive internal controls due to the information they handled, right? A random user following their monthly security awareness checkbox send out a security newsletter to remind people, right? You either get to send out a security newsletter or you get to have the loose lips sink ships posters. So they went with the newsletter option. And they've been doing this for a while, and 1 month a random user reached out and said, hey, you know, I've always felt kind of odd about this thing, but I'm probably just wrong. Like, you techie people are all very advanced, and it's not my thing. But I just wanted to kind of understand why this was a good idea. I'm sure it is, but I want to know why it's a good idea. Well, tell us what's going on. Well, every 6 weeks, when we change our passwords, my manager comes around and makes us write all our passwords down on a clipboard. And when we go on vacation, she makes us give her our proximity cards that go to our individually locked offices, because again, regulated financial institution. And she says that she needs this to make sure that her organization can be super efficient, right? And that making sure this happens is part of why our group has such high bonuses compared to other organizations, because we're super efficient. So, like, that seems odd, but I'm sure it's all for the best. Tell me why I shouldn't be afraid of this. And their response was to fire basically everyone but this person in the division, right? Because this is Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. This is bad. This is a reportable breach that goes to the SEC. From a non-technical user who had the actual belief, true or not, but the actual subjective belief that if he went to the security organization, he wouldn't be taunted, right? He might be said, you know, basically, they're there, it's all fine. Here's why that's fine. That's what he expected. That wasn't what he got. I believe they mentioned in the thread that he got a trip to Tahiti instead while they fired everyone else in his organization. But again, it's about setting up this kind of thing, and it isn't instantaneous, right? If you go and just say, I'm an excellent person, you should all love me, people won't. It's a long-term prospect, but eventually these breaches just start coming to you before you get called by a blogger who says, by the way, I have your whole core database, do you want to comment? We ultimately need people to point out that this is not a fortification anymore, if it once was. We need people to point out that some emperors are in fact naked. These people will mostly not be security people. And security only happens when everyone cooperates. And even if abuse feels good, ultimately it hurts your ability to cooperate with your users. So keep your rants to your friends, the ones who buy you beer. This is the fourth principle. Cooperation diminishes proportionately to physical force. Now let's just set aside physical force. If you are using hitting people as part of your standard security practice, you have many problems. Either you work in a very niche industry, which we're just going to move right along from, or you have many problems I'm not going to be able to address within the scope of this talk. As I said in the intro, part of this talk is this time nobody should have to get nailed to anything. So let's talk about compulsion instead, right? Which is the general thing. Like whether or not you're like slamming someone into the ground, compulsion is the you can't go, we're going to question you type thing that police do, or eventually arresting you in a somewhat more sane, less American way. So please stop that is a natural part of security. Please stop plugging things in. Please stop clicking things except the other things that we told you to click because we're bad about clicking. please stop emailing that, etc. It's not inherently bad, right? In most cases, it's the equivalent of please stop hitting yourself. And not in the grade school bully way where I'm just hitting myself with my own fist, right? Like, actually, please stop hurting us. The problem is that if every time somebody asks a question, the answer is no, people stop asking, even if you are right in every one of those cases. And all the questions they asked are, in fact, terrifying. I don't think saying no is wrong or bad or unreasonable, but it chills our ability to participate in the larger business, because they're just going to say, you know what, every time I have one of my brilliant ideas, Brendan tells me it's a terrible idea, right? And I've gotten that before, right? Usually from engineers who really do only have terrible ideas, right? They're like the clock that is wrong every time a day. It's not right twice in a day at all. We don't have a plan for everything because we're not everything, right? We're part of a larger team. So when people come to us with questions, if we're honest, and if you didn't want this to be known to your clients, then don't show this video, we make up our answers on the fly, right? Of course we do, based on our training and based on our experience and everything we know. We make up whatever the answer is. We say, well, I've never seen your specific problem, but here's a lot of related problems. The answer is probably no, because it's going to kill you. So we should use the same technique that another group uses for the same reason, improv groups. And if you've seen improv or if you've taken an improv class, you know what's going on here. The answer, whenever somebody asks a question, no matter how ludicrous, is always yes and. Okay, so it's usually yes and something. Like, yes, and I'm not just wearing a top hat, I'm also riding a leopard, or whatever, right? You continue the story. So I've spent a few months trying this very consciously with one client, and it is hard. When an engineer comes to me and says, hey, can I shoot my own eye out? It is very hard to say yes. The and is critical on the whole shooting your eye out thing, right? You can say, yes, you can do this dangerous thing. Let's talk about how to make it safe. Let's give you some goggles, for instance. And if the goggles work, maybe you'd consider upgrading to like a full face mask, right? Kind of like those big like surgical face shield things. Also, I'm not sure how good you are with the shooting yourself in the eye thing. Let's give you some body armor in case you miss and shoot yourself in the torso. And handle delicately this kind of process, right? Leading them down the primrose path can work very well, right? He helped me do what I asked, right? He showed me how to do what I asked for safely. But it turns out there's a lot of protections we need to do what I asked. So maybe we should redesign this feature without the eye shooty outy part. That doesn't always happen, right? Like, that's victory, right? They didn't do the dumb thing and you didn't have to say no, but sometimes they'll keep the eye shooty outy part, but now they have all these layers of protection that hopefully will keep at least their remaining eye intact. Sometimes they won't use their safety gear either, but they'll at least be more aware that failure is an option, and they'll be more looking for failure, which will enable them to, now switching my metaphors, jump clear of the car after they've driven off the cliff, but before it explodes in midair for no reason except Hollywood. All of these outcomes are better than if you just said, no, please don't do that for the 11th time, and they decided that merely all you wanted in life was to crush their dreams, which is most of what I want in a relationship, but not everything. So over some time of actually trying this myself, and this is hard for me because I am not nice, I was able to change how I thought about these questions from how do I make your new stupid idea as painless for me personally as possible to how do I help you achieve your goals in a way that protects everybody. And that's the developer perspective, right? If you've done software dev, you know that your features don't usually come from you unless you're just developing your own software. They usually come from on high, and you're not tasked to say, your idea is stupid, you're just tasked to finish it. So the business wants what it wants, and your role in security is to enable that. You can terminate individual, truly dangerous ideas, probably. If you have built up enough political capital, you can probably kill the really bad one. But remember that that's a gun you only get to fire a couple times. If you try yes and, you can usually steer them back onto the path. This one is a huge wall of text, right? And this is why I highlight bits in orange that are super important. I also highlighted this one bit in red, right? The idea of without regard to the justice of individual laws or policies, right? That's actually really dangerous for security people because we design a lot of the laws, right? Which is not something that police usually do. And I'll talk a little bit more at the end about the justice or injustice of individual things. But let's talk about the rest of it, right? The individual service and friendship and courtesy and good humor and sacrifice. So again, I hate to see just don't be a jerk because it's somewhat reductive, right? But when you think of like the London police force, you have the nice guy who poses with the tourists idea, right? Not just a jerk. So think of this as a challenge. Can you make people who you dislike, because this happens, not notice? Without giving very much away, I think I can safely say that one of my proudest moments in the last X period of time was when I got an unsolicited letter saying how great I was from a client who I had what I will summarize as a difference of opinion with. This is not easy. This is perhaps the most difficult thing for me personally in this presentation. It's hard to keep up appearances when things are being dangerously mishandled, but it is worth trying. Beyond this, we have this idea of individual sacrifice, right? And this is a critical part. This is right in the middle of the Peelian principles. The idea of individual sacrifice is weird, right? Because with the exception of the weird stories with the guy with the shotgun in the Katrina disaster, it's not like security people are ordinarily being asked to defend data centers with bullets, right? So the way I think of this in terms of security is, yeah, you're not expected to defend your networks with a shotgun, but you are expected to go the extra mile, or the extra 1.6 kilometers in Canadian, to make things work, right? This goes with the fourth principle, don't just say no. And the cool thing is, we have all these conferences as a security industry, right? And you meet people here, and some of that is just professional networking. I'm looking for, if I make my new job, like if I'm done with this job, where should I go next, right? What are cool companies to work with? But the other thing is, in that kind of war stories, telling stories over beer thing, you learn who's working with what technologies. And you can say, hey, I've never worked with X random thing in X environment. Well, I know this guy at the University of Toronto who does all sorts of amazing things, right? The University of Toronto has an IPv5 network. And if you're going, wait, wasn't there a jump? Yeah, there was, but the academics have preserved the middle one for nerd reasons. I have no idea. It's like, I now know a guy that if I want to really troll firewall operators, or if I have a really odd network, I can call to tell me how IPv5 works well enough to secure stuff nearby it, at least. This is an amazing thing, right? Figure out a way to do the research even when it's a pain in the butt, because you're the support organization. And yeah, it's not like you're not busy enough. I'm aware of that. We'll talk more about that next. So the important part here is, again, about that use of force, right? We're going to do it when only we've tried persuading and advice and warning, and none of that worked. Then we're going to use coercive force. And again, we're going to set aside physical force because that's a whole other area. The thing that strikes me most about this principle is that security and IT have a huge amount of tools that creep people out, as I discussed at the beginning. And it creeps people out badly, right? The first time a non-technical user hears about the wall of sheep, or possibly more horrifyingly about DriftNet, which instead of just showing you usernames and passwords, actually shows you all the images loaded live on your network, which is fun for about 10 seconds, and then you hit the point of you cannot unsee that which you have seen, and then you put away DriftNet for the rest of your life. But you also have just simpler tools, right? There are IT people who I know who like to just watch the list of host names scrolling up on their network, right? Just every host name, it just drops a log into their log file, right? Coming off of their border firewalls. And they do that for not bad reasons, right? They're doing that to make sure that the usual pace of activity is going, right? If they dead stop, something's gone wrong at the border. If they drop dramatically at an unexpected time, maybe something has gone offline. It provides them a kind of heartbeat pulse. And they're not really looking at it. Sometimes they might go, who's going to Urban Dictionary at lunch, right? That kind of thing. But mostly they're not looking at it. But this kind of thing, or another great example of this is Exchange's on-demand remote wipe of phones, scares the heck out of non-technical users. And it should. It's an enormous coercive power, right? I can reach out and nuke your phone because you get your email from me. What? Why would you do that? How could you do that? How do you live with yourself? All responses I've actually heard. Because this scares the heck out of people. And if you're the kind of person who tells me that good users should have nothing to be afraid of, because after all, what do you have to hide? I have a lot of things to discuss with you after the presentation, like how do you live with yourself? So, a lot of security and IT people see, again, this kind of being able to use this level of monitoring and control as a perk, right? Not as an abusive perk, but as a standard way that I think of my workflow. And using things like automated monitoring is not optional anymore for network security, but it's not unreasonable to resent human eyes watching us constantly, for the same reason that we resent human eyes watching us move, right? Even if they're not doing anything. If I just sit and stare at somebody for hours on end and follow them around, they're gonna be creeped out, even if I'm not breaking the law, I'm not disturbing the peace, I'm not anything, I'm just really creepy and it annoys people. So how do we solve this? So I had actually this issue at another client. And it was in particular the Exchange remote wipe thing, right? They were just terrified by this concept, right? It was an organization that was very nice, and they didn't like this power. So what we did is we clarified, right? The next time around, when we're talking about this kind of power, we said, look, yeah, we have the ability to do a remote wipe. Here are the circumstances in which we can do a remote wipe, right? Like, we can't do a remote wipe unless you use Exchange to access our server, right? Like, if you use IMAP to access our mail server, that isn't a thing, right? So it's only this cut down set of users. And if you don't like it, you can switch over to IMAP, or you can stop using your work email on your personal phone, and we'll give you a phone, and that's fine too. And even with that, here's the times in which we're going to use it. We've created basically a rules of engagement document, right? And in some groups, this will be more formal than others. I would actually suggest, if you want to do this yourself, make it very formal, add it to your policy kit. And then, if your IT people are abusing this, if they're using it outside of the rules of engagement, fire them. Treat it like any other major policy. Because this is, again, part of how you build trust with your users. You say, yeah, we do have big nuclear weapon type tools. We don't just use them. And that will hopefully work until you turn orange. This is the seventh principle, and this is what I talked about at the beginning, right? The security people or the police are paid to give full-time attention to what is everyone's job. And I could say, this is the, you are all part of security, right? Thing that we all do at the end of security awareness training all those years going, oh God, I hope I don't have to do that for another 10 months. Yeah, not what I'm gonna do. It's not the most important part of this. The security team is the organization, and the organization is the security team. And I don't know if it's just human to organize into teams and then be a jerk to the other team. It sure seems like it. Just look at any given football match. But it's sure as heck a problem in security, right? We do this with normal users in our organizations, and that hurts our ability to serve the organization. We're not better than the rest of the organization, and it's critical to remember that. So how do we get over that barrier? What helps me, but may not be directly applicable to you, you'll have to see, is to get in there and pull, right? Like, actually go in and work with the developers. If you're actually a developer, you could, in fact, fix a bug. Try it. Just try fixing a bug. Any bug. Find a low-level bug that won't harm anything, and that hopefully will be relatively small, and see how it is to build up their workflow, right? Especially if you have developers who are saying that your security thing is hurting their workflow, which, depending on your organization, might actually be a problem. It could help to just say, I know enough Java not to be deeply dangerous. This is a typo we have to fix on a JSF file or something. I can fix the typo and learn about how the developer workflow is. You'll gain a few things. One, you'll find out, first of all, if your security things really are hurting the developer workflow, which may not be true. Secondly, you'll learn if their developer tools are hurting your security workflow. For instance, if you work in an organization that uses Vagrant, how many of you guys use Vagrant or know what Vagrant is, right? Nobody knows what Vagrant, okay, like 10 people know what Vagrant is. For the rest of you, Vagrant is a way to automatically spin up virtual machines for developers, okay? It's a very common developer tool. It's really great because then you can just say, here's a Vagrant file. Think of it like a chef recipe, right? Or a Puppet configuration file, but it's for local virtual machines. So it's a quick way to just go, shazam, you've got a developer environment that we know works. Vagrant just introduced a new feature relatively recently called Vagrant Share. And what Vagrant Share does is it punches a hole in your firewall and lets anyone who can pick, they do kind of a correct horse battery staple idea. So if you go to correct-horse-battery, it's only 3 words, vagrantshare.com, you now have access to all of the systems from the perspective of the virtual machine sitting on the developer laptop for all ports. So you can do SSH out of that machine, you can do port 443 out of that machine, and you're supposed to use it to access what's running on that server. But of course, if the virtual server is misconfigured or if it's just a default installation, you can do anything. And I can see several horrified looks for people in the audience who are now about to go say, wait, have I turned this off yet? No, you probably haven't, right? It's an outgoing firewall punching tool. There are actual developer things that this actually fixes, right? This is not just an insane tool. So if your developers are using this, they probably have a reason they want to use it. That reason is probably not good enough from your perspective, and that's fine. But now you are going to crimp their workflow. And what working through the developer environment will help you do is figure out how you can adjust their workflow to not cause a raging ball of pain in the middle of your environment, which Vagrant Share, unless you are fully like Jericho, tear down the firewall level compliant, this will probably cause a raging ball of pain, right? If you're not a developer, or if actually fixing a bug is simply an insane request, and I understand, it can be insane or it can be a violation of separation of duties, and either one of those is legitimate. Help developers do threat modeling, or help developers with even like feature design or documentation. Just be another engineer that they can at least bounce an idea off of. Something where that they know that you actually care about their existence. It doesn't have to be a constant thing, but doing it once in a while, particularly in an organization where there's a significant either cultural divide or often age difference between you and the developers. And I've actually been in organizations terrifyingly on both sides of a major age difference, right? One where I was 20 years younger than everyone else, and one where I was 5 to 10 years older than everybody else. Both of those horrify me because I'm not that old. So in all these situations, it helps to make everyone feel like you don't think you're better than the developers, right? Or better than the whatever, and including you, which is nice. And again, it also helps you show you where all the developer pain points are, because the developers aren't coming to these solutions and saying, hey, I'm gonna destroy your firewall in every way possible. They're trying to fix a problem. And maybe you can help that problem given your vast security knowledge and networking knowledge and all these things. You can say, actually, if all you need is to be able to access this one service, why don't I spin up a virtual machine for you? So instead of punching directly into our core network, let's push, like as a testing or QA environment, somewhere else. It's a little bit less crazy. One other note on this principle. The police are the people and the people are the police. A corollary to that is necessarily that the security organization should be like all of the people. I continue to be horrified at this small but loud faction of the security industry that openly discriminates. And they openly discriminate sometimes based on protected classifications, right? Like race or gender or appearance. And a few months ago, I heard a C-level officer of a major security company, a really big one, say that his presentation at a conference was, quote, not for the beautiful people, end quote, because they don't really get security. I don't know why we're having trouble with that thing. Lord knows we don't have that trouble at SecTor, which is one of the reasons I love SecTor. But it needs to end, not just at SecTor, but everywhere else, and it needs to end right now. But beyond that, there's a more pernicious kind of separation that's less just obviously horrifying. Security is a green field in no small part because it doesn't take a PhD to get here, right? I've worked and I've seen people on stage here at this conference with people who had only a high school diploma or people who had PhDs, right? The flip side of that, however, is how often I see how many people posting that they don't look at resumes of people who have college, right? Who went to college because, man, college ruins your brain, man. You get put inside a box and you can never think your way out again. And this is more common than I would have believed before running into it about 10 times in a week. That's not a more helpful bigotry than saying you'd never hire someone without college. So let's quit that. As long as we're quitting that, let's also quit only hiring people who've hacked since birth. I know prominent technologists, some of whom are speaking at either this conference or other major conferences, for whom security was a second or third vocation, right? There's one major female technologist who came to security out of a PhD program in applied philosophy. And now she's a huge deal security person, right? All of the different paths are all security paths, and we need to embrace that kind of thing. Let's also drop the certification hatred, but I'll come back to that later. If we're going to say how progressive and diverse we are, we should make sure that we actually include diversity, is the summary here. The eighth principle is mostly about the judiciary. The important part is never usurping the powers of people who aren't you. This comes up for security people kind of often, right? We find major security violations that are ongoing, right? You know, people are using technology that's not only not allowed, but it's expressly forbidden because it's deeply dangerous, right? And what that's going to mean for you could be anything from Dropbox to using online PDF converters, which is one of my favorite ones that I found in bad places. And so the question, it comes to the security people, or it doesn't come but is, you know, offered up by the security people, well, that person should be fired. They're deeply bad, right? Not our call, and it makes people scared again about the kind of power we naturally accrete because we're the adults in the room, those of us who act like adults. So I find this one helpful to remember that I'm not the CEO, and that the culture for what's acceptable, from the way employees act, to the way policies are implemented, to security strategy, ultimately goes to the chief executive, the CEO or the board of directors. And security should have a seat at that table, right? And hopefully with a service-oriented approach to running security, you can earn one. But remember that if the CEO is prudent and you make your case well, you'll get your strategy through. And if you don't, and it's actually a problem, and the strategy is imprudent, and you're actually hurting users, you do your best to make your case. And if they're hurting users and you can't live with that, then it's time to find a new position. And that's also a rational response, right? But security doesn't run the organization. Again, even in security-first organizations, security doesn't actually run it, because it's not our thing, right? We have a very specific niche. The 9th principle. We are coming to the end of this, I promise. The test of efficiency is the absence of crime, not us. So I love this photo, right? It's great about how security can blend in. This is my group of ham radio examiners at DEF CON 22, and we look just like normal people. We totally blend into a crowd at DEF CON. You can barely, actually it's bad. Even at DEF CON, we were kind of nerds because we all had glowing call sign badges. But yeah, we totally blend into a normal crowd, right? Security shouldn't be about itself. Ideally, users should go throughout their days without having to think about security per se. We know from study after study that when they have to think about it a lot, they hate it, and they just disable things until they can go back to their job. My favorite recent study on this came out 2 or 3 months ago, was a hospital where the IT staff had implemented passive IR sensors so that when a doctor walked away from a workstation, the workstation would automatically log out. This was for lots of good HIPAA reasons, we can assume. The solution from the hospital staff was very simple. They put a Dixie cup over the infrared sensor so that the infrared sensor would always register presence and therefore would never log out, because they had to get their job done. We don't win in situations where the users feel like we're always spying on them, like if we're watching it live, or like we're always trying to prevent them from getting their job done. We win when users actually get to do their jobs. And that's how best to look excellent to management as well, and that's also how best to make sure that we can change the cultural narrative of security as roadblock. So we need a new narrative, and what that's going to be comes next. It's the first part of my kind of call to action thing. We do a call to action because, first of all the cool kids are doing them now, and secondly, beyond simply applying these principles in your own roles, there's a few more specific things I'd like you to do. It's an obnoxious cliche that the perfect is the enemy of the good, right? Unfortunately, the security as a roadblock thing often comes from this precise problem. Well, that solution involved risk, so it's bad and awful, right? This is another facet of the risk intolerance I discussed at the beginning of this, but it has the amazing ability to stop forward momentum towards lower risk solutions. Well, saying, well, we can't move to the cloud, there's risk. It's like, yes, but our servers are old and unpatched and terrible, there's much more risk there. Well, but I want you to find a risk-free solution. No, that's nonsensical, right? Ultimately, this resolves down to, well, we shouldn't move forward out of our house, which is on fire, onto the street, because the street might catch on fire. And that's true, but there's definitely less fire on the street than there is currently in the house. And if we're on the street, we can continue to go down the street and be chased by fire, right? And being chased by fire is a suboptimal solution, but it's definitely better than remaining in the house, which is currently, again, see above, on fire. So this is the heckler's veto, right? Your solution sucks, cannot cause paralysis for your organization. So end that within yourself. And again, for those of you who are thinking, you know, Brendan does this. Yeah, Brendan does do this. Brendan would like to stop doing this. Brendan is trying really hard. So end it in yourself and try not to tolerate it from others. Explain how risk works. Talk to your local risk person. They have their own conferences too. And that summit is inevitable. And then move forward. Second, this is a CISP. It is not my CISP, though I have one. As far as I can tell, nothing on the CISP, and this has all the, the nice fancy words on the bottom, nothing as I can tell on this piece of paper requires its bearer to be terrible. It is a piece of paper that means you took a test. It is not evil. Please, as an industry, can we stop treating the CISP people as evil? Please do not say every time you've seen something dumb on the internet, well, I'm sure this is totally compliant, right? I'm sure at least 12 CISPs approved this, which, yes, is something I've actually seen from major security people. The same goes for the CISA, right, which is the auditor grade thing, or for graduate degrees, or for undergraduate degrees, or for GEDs, or for liberal arts degrees, or for technical degrees, and double for community college degrees. Interview for skills, stop screening based on having a credential, right? This is part of the skills gap issue. We can't find anyone to hire because we hire saying, well, you've got a liberal arts degree, so therefore you must be bad, right? You must not have spent your entire life hacking. But some of the most talented hackers I've met, one of the other hacker lawyers actually, had things with like undergraduate degrees in Russian literature, and then went on from a degree in Russian literature and founded a pen testing company and sold the pen testing company for $1 bajillion, right? And now he's a lawyer and life is grand. It takes all kinds. And in fact, if you look around at this conference and ask people about their backgrounds, you'll find that we have all kinds. So let's stop hating on all these different ways where someone has chosen a different path to better yourself or better themselves than the one you took. I don't know why this needs saying so much, but it certainly seems to. While we're doing that, if we could stop hating on compliance, it would be nice. Like, I understand it does seem like we have a lot of boxes and we need all of them checked, but honestly, compliance does a lot of great work. It would be cool if we could not be the whipping children. And finally, speak up. There are a few people to whom I truly look up in this industry, and the common thread that runs through each of them is that one can count on them to speak up on behalf of people who need it and who can't speak for whatever reason. Usually they don't get a real seat at the table. If you see your company doing bad things, not simply technical decisions with which you don't agree, but things that are in fact wrong and have measurable harms towards users, speak up. If you see a company that's hurting users privacy, whether it's deliberate, with kind of an evil overlord thing, which is not all the time, or just negligent, or behaving in an illegal or unethical fashion, you have a duty to speak up. We have to move beyond this attitude, even though we're a support organization of just, well, hey, I just work here. We're not the only thing in the company. We are charged as security people with protecting the trust of our fellow employees and protecting the trust of every user of whatever it is that your company makes. What you do protects users from embarrassment, from harassment, or even from violence, depending on what it is you do. And that's a huge responsibility, and it's our duty to live up to it. We only get to be the adults in the room if we act like it when it's hard. And that's something we should look to take from, if not perhaps the typical police officer, who are unfortunately humans, then perhaps from the paragon of policing, right? The idea that we do our job in service to all, regardless of when it gets hard. Thank you. Questions at all? We've got a couple minutes left. Narrow questions? Okay, well, I'm bright in purple and stripy, so if you want to talk later, I will be around. I will be less purple tomorrow, but still relatively stripy. Thank you all very much for coming.